She saved 300 lives in 10 years working the night shift. Not one person in that house believed she belonged at their dinner table. For 3 months, June Holland walked through doors she had no code to open, smiled through insults wrapped in expensive politeness, and was erased from every family photograph, every conversation, every seat that should have been hers. And the man she married, the man who controlled every dock in New Orleans, who could read a lie in a room of 30 people, saw nothing. Until the night his flight was canceled. Until he came in through the kitchen door and heard 3 voices in the dining room. And they weren't insulting his wife. They were planning. And until he understood the thing that was worse than all of it. For 3 months, he hadn't been blind. He'd been blindfolded. If you have ever been made to feel like you weren't enough in a place you were supposed to belong, stay with me until the very end and drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story has traveled. If June's story touched something in you, leave a like. It helps this story find the person who needs to hear it. Share it with someone you know who's still smiling through things they never should have had to carry. And subscribe so you don't miss the next one. My role is that of a Vietnamese to English translation specialist and translation assistant. 14 months before that night, June Holland was standing in the emergency department at Tulane General Hospital at 3 o'clock in the morning, wiping down a blood pressure monitor with an alcohol pad because that was what she did when there was nothing else to do. When the double doors burst open, and a man was wheeled in on a stretcher without anyone calling ahead, with no ambulance, no alert on the board, only the sound of wheels and the hard breathing of men who weren't accustomed to running. No identification, no name. 2 gunshot wounds, one in the left shoulder, one beneath the right rib cage, and an expensive white shirt, ruined in the particular way expensive white shirts always seem to be ruined. 4 men followed the stretcher as far as the doorway of room 4, then stopped and stood there, spaced evenly along the corridor, and hospital security, a man named Marion who had worked there for 17 years, and had once dragged a drunken man out of the waiting room with one hand, looked them over once, turned away, and said nothing. June noticed that. She noticed everything. That was what 10 years of night shifts left inside a person. Not numbness, but a counting machine that ran without stopping somewhere behind the eyes. Counting breaths, counting drops from an intravenous line, counting the seconds between the moment someone stopped speaking and the moment they spoke again. Counting things no one had asked her to count and no one knew she was counting. She pulled the curtain closed. She cut away the shirt. She looked at the 2 wounds, and the counting machine behind her eyes answered before she had time to think, telling her that the bullet in the shoulder wasn't the problem, that the bullet beneath the ribs was the question, and that this man had about 40 minutes before that question answered itself. She didn't ask how he'd been shot. She didn't ask who he was. She didn't ask why 4 men were standing in the hallway like 4 pillars. She bent close enough for him to hear her without forcing her to raise her voice, and she asked whether he was allergic to any medication. He opened his eyes. He looked at her. 6 seconds, she counted without meaning to, and later, much later, she would think that those were the longest 6 seconds of her life, though she hadn't known it then. His eyes were gray, and they weren't fading in the way the eyes of someone losing blood usually faded, and there was no fear in them, no pleading, none of the bewilderment June had seen 300 times on 300 other faces. There was only assessment. He was reading her. Lying on a stretcher with a bullet beneath his ribs, he was reading her the way a man might read a room. Then he spoke, his voice low and slow and entirely unhurried, and said, "You're not afraid." June, tearing open a package of gloves without looking up, said, "I am afraid, but my hands aren't. Lie still." He said nothing more. He didn't close his eyes either. He watched her work through all 40 of those minutes, his gaze never leaving her once, and June had treated hundreds of conscious patients while working on them, but no one had ever looked at her that way. Not like someone waiting to be saved, but like someone making sure he would remember. The attending physician arrived. Then came the operating room. Then the stretcher rolled away, and the 4 men in the hallway separated into 2 pairs and followed, and the corridor was empty again, and June stood there with blood on her gloves while the counting machine behind her eyes kept running, and she thought there was nothing unusual about any of it, only another Tuesday night. She removed her gloves. She washed her hands for 40 seconds, following the exact procedure she'd performed 40,000 times. She returned to the nurse's station and opened the shift tracking board to enter her notes. And there, on the screen, beneath the line for the man who had just been taken to surgery, was another entry: unidentified patient, male, admitted at 2:52 in the morning, room 7, June looked at it for about 2 seconds. 2 nameless patients in one night. In the Tulane Emergency Department. In October. In New Orleans. That was something that happened. She'd once seen 3 unidentified patients during a single shift on the night after a game in the French Quarter. She registered it the same way she registered the rain falling outside, as something real, something recorded, something that required no further thought. And she closed the tracking board and moved on, because Room 9 was calling, and because that was the job, and because June Holland wasn't in the habit of stopping for things that hadn't asked her a question. She would remember that line of text. But not for another 14 months. The nameless man left the hospital after 9 days, and June never saw him again. But 31 days later, at 3 o'clock in the morning, the double doors burst open once more, and another man was brought in. And this time it was a knife wound to the thigh, and this time 5 men followed the stretcher, and one of them wore a gray coat, and said nothing, and stood at the far end of the hallway, instead of outside the treatment room. June didn't look toward him. She worked, but the counting machine behind her eyes had already begun running another line, one she hadn't asked it to run. The following month, it was a bullet wound in the calf. The month after that, it was a man whose cheekbone had been shattered, and June had to keep him conscious while they waited for imaging. Always 3 o'clock in the morning. Always Tulane. Even though there were 4 other hospitals within a 15-minute radius, and 2 of them had better trauma departments. And there was always one detail June told no one, not even Maeve, not even herself in clear words, that in New Orleans there were nurses who called the police when they saw an undocumented gunshot wound and nurses who didn't. And there were nurses who asked patients what had happened in a voice that had already found them guilty. And there were nurses whose hands shook as they pulled the curtain while 4 men stood outside. June belonged to none of those groups. She didn't call the police because the law didn't require her to, and because she had seen what happened to a 19-year-old boy in room 6 when someone did. She didn't ask questions because questions didn't stop bleeding, and her hands didn't shake because they had stopped shaking when she was 22 years old, on a cold tile floor. During 11 minutes, she wouldn't tell anyone about for many years to come. By the 4th month, June did what she always did when something kept repeating and she didn't yet understand it. She counted again. She sat at the nurse's station at 4:30 in the morning, when the ward had fallen quiet, and reopened 4 shift records and compared them. Not because she suspected anything, but because that was how her mind rested. And she found it. The person who brought the patient in. The line recording who had handed him over at the door. January, February, March. 3 times in a row. The same abbreviated name, the same signature the intake clerk had written down from a spoken statement rather than from identification. The man in the gray coat. He had driven the car himself. Not one of the 5 men who came with him. Not the driver standing outside. Not any of the 6 able-bodied adults present who were perfectly capable of holding a steering wheel. Him. The man June had once counted 6 seconds for, had personally driven across the city at 3 o'clock in the morning to bring one of his own men to one specific hospital, one specific department, during one specific shift. June stared at the screen for a long time. Then she made a second comparison she wished she hadn't made. Her schedule. All 3 of those nights had been hers. All 4 of those nights had been hers. 4 out of 4. In a department where the schedule rotated once every 4 weeks. The probability of that happening by chance was a number June didn't need to calculate in order to understand. The next night he came, June was changing the intravenous fluids for a man with a bullet wound in his shoulder, and he stood at the end of the hallway as he always did. And when she walked out, she didn't head toward the nurse's station. She walked straight to him. She stopped 3 feet away, still holding the empty fluid bag in one hand, and she said, without raising her voice and without any preamble, "You have 6 men with driver's licenses standing outside." He looked at her. He didn't ask what she meant. He didn't pretend not to understand. He didn't do the thing June had been waiting for, the thing men always did when they were caught, which was smile and answer a question with another question. He simply stood there and let her words rest between them for about 3 seconds, and June understood that he wasn't deciding how to lie. He was deciding how much truth to tell. Then he said, "You count everything, don't you?" It wasn't a question. And June, who had spent 10 years standing in places where no one had ever noticed what she wrote down, felt something inside her chest shift 1 millimeter in a direction she hadn't given it permission to move. She said, "It's my job." He said, "No, it's who you are." Then he held out his hand and gave her his name for the first time, after 4 months and 4 bullets, and 1 knife. August Fairweather, and June Holland, still holding the empty fluid bag, didn't take his hand. She said, "I already know who you are." That wasn't true. It would take her another 14 months to understand just how wrong she was. The tropical storm came in September of the following year, and it wasn't strong enough to earn its own name on the national news, but it was strong enough to shut down the city and force June to work 16 hours straight because 2 other nurses couldn't make it in. She returned to her apartment at 10 o'clock in the morning, soaked all the way to her waist, and August was sitting at the kitchen table with a book and 2 cups of coffee, one of them already cold, and he looked her over once, from her shoes to the dark circles beneath her eyes, and he didn't ask whether she was all right. He said, "Go to sleep." June had already prepared 3 sentences to refuse him. 3 sentences about how she was fine, about how she would cook something, about how he had driven across the city through a storm to get there, so the least she could do was be a proper host. She didn't say any of them. She went into the bedroom and slept for 9 hours. When she woke, it was dark outside. The rain was still striking the windows in waves, and the light in the living room was still on, and August was still sitting in the same place with the same book, now 2/3 of the way through it. He hadn't woken her for dinner. He hadn't cleaned her apartment. He hadn't gone out to buy food and arranged it for her so she would have to thank him. He had simply stayed there, and June stood in the bedroom doorway in wrinkled clothes, her hair flattened against one side of her head, and looked at the man who controlled the entire port of New Orleans, sitting silently inside a 646-square-foot apartment belonging to a nurse for 9 hours without needing her to do anything at all, and she realized that this was the first time in years someone had been inside her home without making it feel smaller. She sat down across from him. He closed the book, and June, who told her story to no one, began to speak, not because he asked, but precisely because he didn't. She told him about her mother, about the final 14 months, about leaving medical school at 19 to come home, about changing catheters with her own hands and counting doses with her own hands, and about how a person could learn the whole of medicine inside a bedroom without ever earning a degree. Then she stopped for a long while. Then she told him about Wesley, her younger brother, 22 years old. She said he was the only person in the house who knew how to make coffee properly, and that he laughed so loudly the neighbors would pound on the wall, and that she still kept the photograph from the day he graduated from high school, with his thumb raised and a grin on his face as though the whole world had just come to owe him something good. Then she said she had lost him. Then she said she had been the one who was there. Then she said, in a voice as flat as if she were reading from a chart, that she had done everything 10 years of training had taught her to do, for 11 minutes, on a cold tile floor, and it hadn't been enough. And that was why she had chosen the night shift forever, not because the pay was better, because at night, no one asked whether she was all right. The rain kept striking the windows. August didn't tell her she had done everything she could. He didn't tell her it wasn't her fault. He didn't reach across the table to take her hand, didn't stand up, didn't offer her anything June would have to accept and then thank him for. He simply remained seated. 15 minutes, she counted. Then he stood, poured the cold coffee for her, set it down in front of her, and sat again. And June Holland, who had saved 300 lives and failed to save exactly one, drank that cold coffee and didn't cry, and understood that she would marry this man. He proposed to her in April, in the hospital parking lot, at 4 o'clock in the morning, after a shift in which June had lost 2 patients. And he didn't kneel, and there was no music, and no one was filming. He simply stood there leaning against the car and said he wanted to be in that kitchen on the mornings she came home, all of those mornings, until the end. And June said all right, and that was the whole of it. The wedding took place 7 weeks later, and there were 200 guests, and June didn't know 198 of them. She wore her mother's dress. The dress had been lying in a cloth bag at the bottom of the closet for 8 years, and it was loose at the waist because her mother had been 2 centimeters taller than she was, and because her mother had worn it in 1993, when people still believed everything would turn out all right. And June took it to an alterations shop on Magazine Street, and the old seamstress looked at the stitching, then looked at her, and asked whether she wanted it changed or preserved. And June said, "Preserve as much as you can." In the front row, on the left, there was an empty chair. On it, June placed a photograph of her mother standing outside the door of their old apartment, one hand on her hip, laughing because someone beyond the frame had just said something funny. No one asked about the chair. 200 people walked past it, and not one of them asked. Maeve Donnelly was her only bridesmaid. Maeve, who had stood beside June through 6 years of night shifts, who had guarded the bathroom door for her on the night after Wesley, when June didn't want anyone to see her face, who wore a blue dress June had paid for because Maeve had said plainly that she couldn't afford one, and Maeve hugged her before they entered the ceremony and said, "Are you sure?" And June smiled and said, "It's too late now." And Maeve smiled back and didn't say anything else. On the bride's side, that was everything. One photograph and one friend. On the groom's side, there were 200 people, an orchestra, a reception hall overlooking the river, and an emptiness June wouldn't see until many months later. His mother wasn't there. His sister wasn't there. His cousin wasn't there. August had explained. And every explanation made sense. And that was precisely the problem. Because the most dangerous thing isn't a bad lie. It's a truth arranged in exactly the right place. His sister, Theodora, had a mitral valve replacement scheduled 4 months earlier and couldn't move it. And June, being a nurse, understood that better than anyone in the room. And she had nodded and said, "Of course." His mother, Cordelia, 63 years old, was undergoing a course of treatment she didn't wish to discuss and couldn't travel by plane. And June, being a nurse, understood that too, and she had asked whether Cordelia needed anything, and August said she was fine. Thank you. His cousin, Prudence, was in Lisbon, and her flight had been cancelled because of the weather. 3 reasons. 3 different reasons, from 3 different people, for the same absence. June had counted everything in her life. She counted breaths, counted intravenous drops, counted 6 seconds in the emergency room, and 15 minutes in the kitchen, and 11 minutes on the cold tile floor. But she didn't count this. She didn't place those 3 reasons beside one another on the same line, and look at them the way she would look at a chart. The thing she had done 40,000 times with other people's numbers, and later she would think about it for a very long time. How a person with a counting machine running constantly behind her eyes could turn it off exactly once, at the one moment when it needed to be running. But June knew the answer. She knew it even then, somewhere beneath the surface of consciousness, and she chose not to look at it. Because in 32 years, no one had ever wanted her enough to build an entire wedding for 200 people. Because her mother was gone, and Wesley was gone, and she had sat at the nurse's station at 4 o'clock in the morning on more nights than she had slept in her own bed. And now there was a man standing at the end of the aisle looking at her the way he had looked at her from emergency room number 4, the look of a person committing something to memory. And a drowning person doesn't count the strands in a rope. She only grabs hold. 3 weeks after the wedding, June Holland got into a car bound for the Fairweather estate, and she still hadn't met a single one of them. The car traveled 50 minutes beyond the city, and the estate appeared around a bend, its red brick darkened by 100 years of rain, its white columns so tall that June had to tilt her head back to see them. 3 women stood waiting on the steps, and they had been standing there before the car even passed through the gates. June knew because she saw them the moment the road curved, while the entrance was still 200 meters away, which meant they had come outside early, which meant they had prepared. And the counting machine behind her eyes, the machine that had been silent for all 7 weeks since the wedding, began running again. 3 people. No one waved. No one came down a single step. They stood in an uneven line, the woman in the center half a step behind the other 2, and June, who had spent 10 years learning how to read a room in 2 seconds, because 2 seconds was often all she had, realized that the word forming in her mind wasn't welcome. She searched for the right word as the car rolled over the gravel, and when she found it, it made her cold. Triage. That was how people stood at the entrance to an emergency department on the night of a bus crash, when 4 stretchers arrived at once, and the coordinator had 3 seconds to decide who went into surgery first, who received blood, who was moved aside and given pain medication and left alone. June had stood in that position. June knew that look from the inside, and she was driving straight into it. She pushed the thought away. She had traveled for 14 hours many times in her life, and she knew that when a person was exhausted, everything could look like a threat. And she had worked the night shift only 2 nights earlier, and she was wearing a coat Maeve had said might be a little too plain, and that was all. Just nerves. August opened the car door for her. Cordelia Fairweather was 63 years old, and she didn't hurry, not because she was trying to appear unhurried, but because she had never needed to hurry in her life. And she reached out with both hands and took both of June's, not embracing her, only holding them, and said in a perfectly warm voice that the whole family had heard so much about her. June said, "I hope it was good." Cordelia said, "Of course," and her smile reached exactly as far as it needed to and then stopped. not moving another millimeter, and June knew that precise point of stillness because she had seen it on doctors' faces when they stepped out of a patient's room to speak with the family. The second woman was Theodora, 41 years old, with closely cropped hair and a surgeon's hands, long fingers and nails trimmed so short there was nothing left to cut. She didn't take June's hand. She looked down at June's hands for about 1 second, the quick, professional glance June had received thousands of times from doctors at Tulane, the look that judged whether those hands could do the work, and for the first time in years, June became conscious of the cracks at her fingertips, of the dry skin across the backs of her hands, the result of washing them 40 times per shift for 10 straight years. Theodora said, "Hello," and nothing more. The third woman was Prudence, 29 years old, and she didn't remain still. She came down all 4 steps and wrapped both arms around June, both of them, tightly, resting her chin on June's shoulder for 1 second, and whispered into her ear that she was finally here, that she had been waiting for this for such a long time. And June Holland, who hadn't been held like that by anyone since the funeral, who had stood before 200 strangers with a photograph of her mother resting on an empty chair, held on to that embrace longer than she had intended, half a second, perhaps 1 full second. Long enough that Prudence had to be the one to let go first. Long enough for Cordelia, standing on the steps, to see it. And later, much later, when June knew everything, when she sat in another kitchen at 3 o'clock in the morning and put the pieces of those 3 months back together in chronological order, the way she would reconstruct a medical chart, she would understand that this had been the decisive moment. Not the dinner, not the gate code, that single second on the steps, when 3 women saw exactly what they needed to see. That this woman was starving, that she would take whatever was offered to her, and that, therefore, she could be starved. Dinner began at 7 o'clock, and by 7:20, August stood and apologized because he had a phone call, and he went into the adjoining room, and the door closed behind him, and June was left alone with the 3 women, and she would always remember that he didn't look back. Theodora Fairweather poured June's water before pouring her own. That was the first thing she did, and it was polite, and June said, "Thank you." Then Theodora asked, in a light, friendly voice, the kind of voice people used to make conversation rather than conduct an interrogation, "Which medical school did you attend?" And June, who had answered this question 400 times in her life, at 400 parties, and in 400 waiting rooms, opened her mouth and said, "I didn't go to medical school. I'm a nurse." 4 seconds. June counted them because she couldn't help counting. 4 seconds in which no one lifted a fork, no one drank, no one looked at anyone else. 4 seconds that in an emergency department were enough for a person to lose consciousness, and at the Fairweather dinner table were enough for a woman to understand her place. Then Cordelia set down her fork, very gently, without making a single sound against the plate, and said, "Oh," and she let that word remain there for 1 beat. Then she said, "Then you're very practical." The pause before the final word lasted exactly long enough for everyone at the table to understand that she had considered and rejected 3 other words. Prudence gave 1 brief laugh, and then stopped. Theodora didn't laugh. She simply nodded, slowly, as though a piece of information had just been entered into the proper box, and said, "Practical is what hospitals need." Then she drank her water. And June sat there with the word practical resting on the table before her like a plate no one intended to clear away. She should have known who Theodora was. In truth, she had known before arriving, because every nurse in Louisiana knew that name. Theodora Fairweather, 41 years old, a cardiovascular surgeon at Oxnard, whose name appeared on 3 papers June had read during quiet night shifts, who had replaced a valve for a state senator, and for 2 people the press wasn't permitted to name. But what June didn't know, what would take her another 7 weeks to fit into its proper place, was that Theodora wasn't only a doctor to outsiders. She was the doctor of this family. For 5 years, every examination, every course of treatment, every appointment belonging to anyone with the Fairweather name had passed across her desk. She knew which medications Cordelia took. She knew what Prudence was allergic to. She knew exactly when her younger brother left the city because every one of August's trips included a physician escort, and she was the person who arranged that physician. She didn't need to monitor anyone. They submitted their schedules to her themselves, every month, in writing, voluntarily, and called it medical security. Theodora Fairweather had never raised her voice in her life. June would spend 3 months there and never hear her speak loudly even once, not once, and that was precisely what made her more dangerous than her mother. She didn't humiliate anyone. She only asked questions. She asked questions June didn't have the credentials to answer, and she asked them with a voice of genuine curiosity. And when June answered correctly, she nodded. And when June couldn't answer, she nodded in exactly the same way, and it was that sameness that made it a knife. That evening, she asked 2 more questions. The first was about an anticoagulant June knew well, and June answered correctly, and Theodora said, "Good." The second was about the ejection fraction in a particular case she had operated on the week before, a detail no emergency nurse in the world would ever need to know. And June remained silent, and Theodora said, "It's all right. I was only asking out of curiosity." Then she changed the subject to the weather. The door to the adjoining room opened at 8:10. August returned to the table, sat beside his wife, placed a hand on the back of her chair, and looked around the table with the gaze June had once believed could detect a lie in a room of 30 people. He said, "What were you all talking about that was so entertaining?" And Cordelia smiled and said, "We're only getting to know one another." And that was the truth. That was the most terrible thing about the sentence. It was completely true. The first blow came during the second week, at a dinner with 14 guests, and it didn't make a sound. June was seated 3 chairs away from August, which was perfectly normal, and she thought nothing of it. But after the guests had entered the dining room, while everyone was still standing and talking around the table, Cordelia walked along the edge of it with a glass of wine in her hand, stopped at June's place, and changed the silverware. It took her about 4 seconds. She lifted the silver knife and fork, the same set all 13 of the others had, and replaced them with another set from the sideboard behind her, identical in style but not in material, lighter, duller, the kind people used for garden parties. She didn't look at June. She didn't say anything. She continued walking and told one of the guests that there had been far too much rain that year, and June, standing 6 feet away with her glass of water in her hand, saw all of it, and the counting machine behind her eyes recorded that not one of the other 13 people had noticed a thing, because it was too small, because it didn't exist unless you were already looking for it, and because that was precisely how it had been designed. Throughout that dinner, June held a fork that weighed 30 grams less than everyone else's, and she smiled, and she answered questions about her work briefly, and when August asked whether she was all right on the way back to their room, she said, "I'm fine," because she had tried to imagine the other sentence in her head. "Your mother changed my fork," and she heard how insane it sounded when spoken aloud. That was the mechanism. Every blow was designed to sound insane when retold. June discovered the second one during the 6th week, and she discovered it not because anyone told her, but because she counted. A gardener named Elias came on Tuesdays, a man around 60 years old who worked seasonally for 3 months each year, and June was standing at a second-floor window one morning when she saw him drive his truck up to the gate, lower the window, and enter 4 digits. The gate opened. He drove through. June remained at that window longer than necessary. Then she went down to the kitchen and asked Rufus, the house steward, a question she tried to make sound as casual as possible. She asked, "What is the gate code?" And Rufus Okonkwo, who had lived in that house for 31 years, whose face June would later understand was the face of a man who had seen too much, stopped what he was doing for exactly 1 beat before answering. 1 beat. June caught it. Then he said, "Ma'am, I'm not authorized to provide the code. You'll need to ask Mrs. Cordelia." And June said, "Thank you," and went upstairs, and sat on the edge of the bed in her own room, inside her own husband's house, and did the calculation. The gardener who worked 3 months a year had the code. She, who had signed a marriage certificate 8 weeks earlier, didn't. The third blow wasn't 1 blow. It was 90 blows, 1 every day for 3 months, and that was why it was the last thing to break her instead of the first. June worked the night shift. June came home at 7 o'clock in the morning, or 8, or 9 if a shift ran long, and every time she stood outside the gates of her own home and pressed the intercom, she stood there in her nurse's uniform, wearing shoes that had carried her for 16 hours, and waited for someone inside the house to answer and let her in. Some days it was Rufus, and he opened the gate immediately, and he never asked a question, and June would later understand that his speed was the only way he was allowed to tell her that he knew. Some days it was the security officer, and it took 2 minutes. Some days no one answered for 4 minutes, and every time June mentioned it to Cordelia, every single time, Cordelia placed a hand on her arm, a warm and flawless gesture, and said the same sentence. "Oh, I thought you already had it. I'll speak to security." The 4th week, the 7th week, The 9th week, the 11th week, the same sentence, the same touch, the same gentle and well-meaning surprise, performed perfectly down to the smallest beat. And June heard it 5 times before she understood that it wasn't forgetfulness. Forgetfulness changes. The next time, forgetfulness says, "They still haven't taken care of that," or, "Oh no," or, "Let me call them right now." This didn't change. This was identical 5 times, word for word, like a line that had been rehearsed. And in the 11th week, standing outside the gate at 7 o'clock in the morning after a shift in which she had performed chest compressions on a 60-year-old man and kept him alive, June Holland finally saw what she had been looking at for 3 months without seeing it. They hadn't forgotten her. They were telling her, once every morning, with perfect precision, that she was a guest. The Fairweather family took their family portrait during the 2nd week of November every year, and they had done so for 31 years, and they hired a photographer from a studio in the Garden District that August's father had once used, and they always took the picture on the front steps, always on the front steps, because it was tradition, and because in that house tradition was another word for punishment. June had known about the portrait session 3 weeks in advance. She had changed shifts. She had requested a night off she shouldn't have requested, and Maeve had covered for her, and June had bought a navy blue dress, because Prudence said navy matched that year's color palette. That morning she woke at 6 o'clock, she, who slept during the day, and stood in front of the mirror longer than she had in many years. By 9 o'clock, when the photographer had finished setting up the equipment, Cordelia walked out onto the steps, looked around, and said to June in the gentlest voice in the world, "Dear, would you help me hold that light? They're short one pair of hands." June held the light. It was a reflector mounted on a stand, about 5 feet tall, and it wasn't heavy, and it didn't need anyone to hold it, because it had a base, because that was the entire purpose of the base. But June held it. She stood about 10 feet to the left of the frame in her navy blue dress, one hand raised to steady something that didn't need steadying, and watched the 3 women and her husband arrange themselves in a line on the steps and smile. 40 minutes. The photographer asked everyone to change positions 7 times, and during those 7 changes, not once did anyone say the sentence June had waited to hear for the entire 40 minutes, the sentence only 4 words long. Let her come in. August stood in the middle. He looked toward the camera. He didn't turn his head, and June, holding the light, understood that he thought she was helping, that in his mind, at that very moment, his wife was kindly lending a hand, and it was sweet, and he would thank her afterward. That was what June would never forgive herself for later. Not Cordelia, not the 40 minutes, but the fact that she had stood there and made their lie believable. She had held the light too naturally. She had played her part in their performance better than they had. At 10 o'clock, while the photographer was packing away the equipment and everyone was beginning to scatter, June set the light down and walked around to the back garden to get some air, and she saw Maeve Donnelly. Maeve, there, 50 minutes from the hospital, on a Saturday morning, standing beside the side path of the house and speaking to someone who had just disappeared through a door. June called her name. Maeve turned, and her face did something June noticed but didn't interpret. Something very quick, about half a second, like a person calculating rather than a person feeling happy. Then Maeve smiled and hugged her and said, "My God, you're wearing a dress." And June laughed and asked what she was doing there. And Maeve said, smoothly, without stumbling, without hesitation, without a single beat out of place, "I was just dropping off some records for Dr. Fairweather. She needed a referral file. Our department has the original, and it was on my way, so I brought it over." A perfect answer. It made sense. It was specific. It contained 3 professionally accurate details, and it came out about a quarter of a second faster than a truthful answer would have. And June, who counted everything, whose machine behind her eyes had caught all 3 details and placed them on the scale, looked down at her friend's feet at the same time. New shoes. Real leather, reddish brown. The kind with stitching across the toe that June had once seen in a shop on Royal Street the year before, had looked at the price, and had kept walking. Maeve Donnelly, who 6 months earlier hadn't been able to afford a bridesmaid's dress. 3 facts. They rested there on the same line, exactly as the 3 reasons for the absences at the wedding had once rested there. And June Holland did exactly what she had done before. She said, "Well, that's convenient," and asked whether Maeve wanted coffee. And Maeve said, "I have to run, afternoon shift." And they hugged again and Maeve left. June remained alone in the garden. She knew. Somewhere beneath the surface of consciousness, in the part of her that had read a heart monitor in 2 seconds for 10 years, she knew. But she had spent 3 months without the gate code, and 3 months smiling over forks that weighed 30 grams less than everyone else's. And that morning she had just spent 40 minutes holding a light so her husband could take a family portrait without her, and Maeve was the only person left from the world in which June had once been a human being. A drowning person doesn't test the rope, she only grips it tighter. What drove June mad wasn't the blows, it was the way they disappeared. Because there were days when that house was so kind that she began to distrust her own mind. There were mornings when Cordelia asked whether she had slept well, and listened to the answer. There were dinners when Theodora asked her about a case and nodded while she spoke and said she thought the same thing. There was one afternoon when Prudence invited her into the garden and showed her the magnolia tree August had climbed when he was 7 and broken his arm, and they both laughed, and June returned to her room, feeling warm and guilty. Guilty for thinking badly of those women. Guilty because the counting machine behind her eyes refused to turn off. And then, 3 days later, she was standing outside the gate again at 7 o'clock in the morning, pressing the intercom. That was what wore a person down. Not constant cruelty. Intermittent cruelty. Never knowing which version of the house you were inside, and therefore never being able to tell anyone, because to tell someone, you had to be certain, and you weren't permitted to be certain. In the 12th week, June did the thing she had avoided for 3 months. She began keeping records, not because she suspected anyone. That was what she told herself, and she almost believed it, that she was only doing what she had done 40,000 times in her life, recording events in chronological order to see what they said, because that was how a nurse thought, because one symptom by itself meant nothing and a pattern of symptoms meant everything. She bought a small notebook at the pharmacy near the hospital. She kept it in her locker in the changing room and didn't bring it home. And later she wouldn't know why she had done that, or she would know and wouldn't want to admit it. And she began to write. She wrote the date. She wrote the time. She wrote what had happened in the most neutral language she possessed, the language she had used to describe 40,000 patients, without adjectives, without emotion, only facts. 7:10, rang the bell, waited 3 minutes. 7 o'clock, dinner, 14 guests, replacement silverware. 9 o'clock, portrait session, asked to hold light, duration 40 minutes, 11 entries, then 19, then 27. And at the 27th entry, June sat in the changing room at 5 o'clock in the morning after her shift, the notebook open across her lap, and she saw it, the second column. She had recorded, out of habit, out of the damned habit of a person who recorded everything, one detail she had never intended to analyze. Whether August was home. 27 entries, not one of them, not a single one, had happened while he was in the house. June sat there for a long time. Then she did the worst thing she could have done to herself. She went one step further, because if none of it happened while he was home, there were 2 possibilities, and a nurse was trained not to stop at the more comforting one. The first possibility was coincidence, because he traveled often, and therefore most things naturally happened while he was away. June calculated. During those 3 months, August had been home for 41 nights out of 92, almost half. If it were random, then roughly 12 entries should have fallen on nights when he was there. None had. The second possibility was that they had a schedule, and June sat in the changing room beneath the fluorescent lights and thought about the next question. The question every nurse knew was the real one. Not what is happening, but who has access. Who knew every hour in advance when August would leave the city? Not Cordelia. She never asked her son for his schedule. Not Prudence. She couldn't even remember what day of the week it was. The person who knew was the person with the paperwork. Every one of August's trips included a physician escort. It was an organizational procedure that had existed long before June arrived, and the person who arranged that physician, who received the schedule in writing, who signed it, filed it, knew which flight left at what hour and returned at what hour, and had done so for 5 years, was his sister. June didn't write the name in the notebook. She sat there looking at the 27 entries and felt something she had never felt in 10 years in the emergency department. Not fear, because fear was familiar to her, but the coldness of a person who had finished reading the chart and understood that this wasn't a heart attack. This was something that had been inside the body for a very long time. Because malice is messy. Malice erupts when people are angry, when they're drunk, when they lose control, and malice leaves traces everywhere. This wasn't messy. This had columns. This had dates and times and repetition precise down to every word in the sentence. "I'll speak to security," and it knew exactly when to stop. This wasn't three women who hated her. This was a procedure, operated by someone accustomed to operating procedures, designed never to be present at the same time as the one person who could stop it. June closed the notebook. She locked the locker. She walked out to the parking lot at 5:20 in the morning and sat in her car without starting the engine. And she understood that she had just finished proving something she couldn't prove to anyone else. The Fairweather Foundation fundraiser took place on a Thursday evening at the Roosevelt Hotel, and it raised $1,800,000 for community health programs, and Cordelia delivered a 7-minute speech about how providing care was the moral obligation of those fortunate enough to have the means, and the entire room applauded. August didn't attend. He was in Houston. June had checked the notebook inside her mind before getting into the car, and she had known. And she went anyway, because not going would require an explanation, and explaining would require saying it aloud, and she wasn't ready to do that. At 9 o'clock, Theodora led her to a table in the corner of the room where 5 people were standing, and June recognized 4 of the 5 faces from the medical journals she read during night shifts: the head of cardiology at Oxnard, a professor from LSU, 2 members of the state medical board. Theodora placed a hand against June's back, an intimate gesture, almost sisterly, and said in the warm, proud voice of someone presenting a member of the family, "Everyone, this is my sister-in-law. She works at Tulane." Then she paused for exactly 1 beat. Then she said, "Downstairs," and the entire table laughed. Not cruelly. That was the part June would never be able to explain to anyone. They laughed the way people laughed when someone had just made a charming remark, a brief, polite, knowing laugh, and during those 2.5 seconds, June Holland stood among 5 people with a combined total of roughly 120 years of medical education and understood that she had just been placed on a scale, weighed, and handed back, that it had been done with exactly 5 words, and that the person who had done it still had a hand resting against her back. And June laughed with them. That was the detail she would remember, not the sentence, not their laughter, but the muscles in her own face, automatic, trained through 10 years of standing before doctors who spoke to her in that same voice, lifting into a smile before her mind had time to object. She said, "Downstairs is where everyone comes first." The head of cardiology said, that's right," and patted the LSU professor on the shoulder, and the conversation moved on to a research foundation in Atlanta, and June remained there for another 4 minutes before excusing herself to get some water. She went into the restroom. She didn't cry. She washed her hands for 40 seconds, according to protocol, and looked at her cracked hands beneath the running water, and her phone vibrated inside her purse. "Maeve, 3 messages. The first said, 'I heard something happened tonight.' The second said, 'Are you all right?' The third said, 'June, don't make a scene. It isn't worth it.'" June stood in the restroom of the Roosevelt Hotel at 9:20 that evening and stared at those 3 lines. The fundraiser was taking place 6 kilometers from Tulane Hospital. Maeve was working the night shift. Not one of the 5 people at the table in the corner knew who Maeve Donnelly was. June hadn't messaged Maeve. No one had messaged Maeve. It had happened 18 minutes earlier, and the counting machine behind her eyes, the machine that had caught the half-second of hesitation in the garden, and the reddish-brown leather shoes, and the quarter-second too fast in the perfect answer about the referral records, registered all of it, placed it in the proper column, and delivered its conclusion, clean and cold as a chart. And June Holland looked at that conclusion. Then she replied, "I'm fine, thank you." She didn't ask how Maeve knew. She put the phone away. She returned to the ballroom and remained there for another 40 minutes, and she thanked Cordelia for the beautiful speech, and she drove 50 minutes home. She pressed the intercom. She waited 2 minutes. The gate opened. No one in the house was awake. June entered the kitchen without turning on the light. She stood there for a while in the darkness, still wearing that dress, still wearing those shoes, and then she opened the refrigerator. White light spilled across the kitchen floor and over her legs. Inside was enough food for a family of 14, arranged in glass containers with handwritten labels. Everything orderly, everything complete, everything belonging to someone. June stood looking at it. 3 minutes. She counted, because she always counted, 180 seconds, standing before an open refrigerator, in a house she didn't have the code to enter. She wasn't hungry. She wasn't searching for anything. She didn't reach for a single thing. Then she closed the refrigerator door, and the kitchen went dark again, and June Holland walked upstairs in the darkness. And she didn't turn on the bedroom light, and she lay down beside the empty place where her husband would have been if he had been home. June Holland owned 3 things in this world that she would run into a fire to retrieve, and all 3 of them were kept inside a pale blue tin that had once held Danish cookies, the kind of tin every working family in America seemed to own and none of them ever used for cookies. The first was a photograph. In it, a 19-year-old boy wore a blue graduation gown, his cap tilted because he had never worn anything straight in his life, one hand holding his high school diploma and the other giving a thumbs up toward the camera, and he was laughing loudly, his mouth open, his head tipped slightly back, the kind of laugh that belonged to someone who had heard something funny just before the picture was taken and hadn't had time to pull it back in. June was the one behind the camera. She had been standing about 10 feet away, and she had just told him he looked like a lamppost in a graduation gown, and that was why he was laughing. His name was Wesley Holland, the boy who had once filled her world with laughter, now frozen forever at 19. She had kept that memory safe for 10 years, a reminder of the one life she couldn't save on that cold tile floor. The second was a plastic hospital wristband, white and yellowed with age, printed with the name Deborah Maureen Holland, an identification number, and a date in 2013. A nurse had cut it from her mother's wrist and was about to throw it away when June reached out and said, "May I have that?" The third, and the one June would choose if she were forced to choose only one, was a leather-bound notebook worn smooth at all 4 corners. Her mother had been a nurse, 31 years at Charity Hospital and then Tulane, and she had kept that notebook since 1988, and inside it was her handwriting, small and tightly slanted, recording the things no school ever taught. How to speak to a family at 3 o'clock in the morning, how to hold the hand of a frightened man without making him feel ashamed, how to remove a needle from a child, and on page 47, written in blue ink during some night in 1996, there was one line June had probably read 200 times in her life, read in the parking lot after her worst shifts, a sentence her mother had written for herself and no one else. "You aren't the one who decides who lives. You're the one who stays in the room." June brought that tin with her when she moved into the estate. She placed it on a low shelf in the small sitting room in the East Wing, the room no one used, the room she had asked about and been told, "Make yourself at home, dear. No one has used that space in years." During the 13th week, Theodora had the sitting room cleared out. She told Rufus the East Wing needed to be reorganized before Thanksgiving, and she supervised it herself, and she instructed the household staff to discard anything of unknown origin, and those were the exact words she used. June knew because she asked Rufus later, and he repeated them word for word with the eyes of a man handing over evidence. Anything of unknown origin. June came home at 7 o'clock the following morning. It had rained through the night. She pressed the intercom, waited, the gate opened, she drove in, and she crossed the back courtyard toward the kitchen door. And she saw it. The pale blue tin, lying on its side inside the outdoor trash bin, its lid sprung open. June didn't run. That was what 10 years of night shifts had left behind in her. She walked toward it at an ordinary pace, lifted it out, placed it on the lid of the bin, opened it, and did what she had done 40,000 times before, assessing the damage in order of priority. The photograph was all right. It had been sealed inside a plastic sleeve. Wesley was still laughing, still giving a thumbs up, still 19 years old, untouched. The wristband was all right. Plastic wasn't afraid of water. The notebook wasn't. It had lain in the rain from 9 o'clock the night before until 7 o'clock the next morning, 10 hours. And the paper had swollen to nearly twice its size, and the leather cover had curled, and when June opened it, the blue ink on page 47 had bled into a pale wash stretching from one edge to the other, and her mother's handwriting, small and tightly slanted, 31 years of it, had become a cloud. June stood there for a long time. Then she sat down on the back steps with the wet notebook across her lap, and she didn't cry. She hadn't cried during those 11 minutes on the cold tile floor, and she wouldn't cry now, not because she was strong, but because that mechanism had broken a long time ago and no one had ever repaired it. What she felt was worse. It was a calm and perfectly clear understanding, the kind of understanding a nurse had when she looked at a monitor and knew that rhythm wasn't coming back. A photograph could be taken again. A wristband could have belonged to anyone. But the handwriting of someone who was gone had no copy. There was no original, stored anywhere else. There was no one left in the world who could form those letters in that exact way. It had existed in one place only, for 31 years. And now it no longer existed. And it had taken 10 hours. And the person who had done it didn't even understand what she had done. At 4 o'clock in the morning, 9 days later, June was still sitting on those steps after her shift, holding the notebook, now dry and twisted out of shape, in her hands. She couldn't read anything anymore. She turned the pages one by one and looked at the pale blue clouds, and then she did the only thing she still knew how to do. She counted her own breaths. 1, 2, 3, the question anyone would ask, and the question June would ask herself for many years afterward, was why she didn't speak. Her husband controlled the entire port of New Orleans. He could have ended all of it with a single sentence over breakfast. She had a notebook containing 27 clean entries, with dates, times, and a comparison column. The kind of evidence a lawyer would have kissed her forehead for producing. All she had to do was open her mouth. But June Holland had learned a lesson when she was 19 years old, and that lesson lay deeper than reason, deeper even than the notebook. That was the year her mother became ill, and June left medical school. And her father, who had walked away when she was 6, came back exactly once. He sat in the kitchen for 40 minutes. He said he had a new family in Baton Rouge, 2 children, a job, and he couldn't do it. And June, 19 years old, made him choose. She said the words aloud, clearly, without crying, "Choose, Dad." And he chose. He stood, walked out the door, and never came back. And the lesson wasn't that her father was a bad man. The lesson was this: when you force someone to choose between what they had before and what they have only just found, they will always choose what came before, and you won't lose that person. You will lose the illusion that you ever had them. That was what June feared. Not that August wouldn't believe her. That he would rise from the dinner table and walk into the adjoining room and do what a man like him did, and then 3 months later, or 3 years later, he would look at her one morning, and there would be a calculation in his eyes, the calculation every man made, that he had traded his mother and his sister and that entire house for this woman, and whether she had been worth it. And June didn't want to exist inside a calculation. She would rather smile for 3 months than become a number inside the mind of the man she loved. So she remained silent, and she told herself she was protecting him, and it would take her a very long time. In a kitchen at 3 o'clock in the morning, to admit that this was a kind lie she had told herself. But June didn't sit still. People don't remain silent by ceasing to think. They remain silent by moving their thoughts somewhere else. And 3 nights after what happened to the notebook, at the nurse's station at 3:10 in the morning, June did something she told herself was harmless. She reopened the records from that night in room 4. She wanted to look at it again, the first night, the night of the 6 seconds. She wanted to look once more at the things she had believed, the way people look at an old photograph to remember that they had once been happy. She searched the date. She opened the shift record from that night, the record she had closed 14 months earlier after noting it the way one noted the weather, and the second line was still there: unidentified patient, male, admitted at 2:52 in the morning, room 7. And June, who had lawful access to the records of her own department, who was reviewing the documentation from her own shift, scrolled down. Outcome: deceased, 4:17 in the morning. June sat very still. She had been there. She had been 18 meters away from room 7, inside room 4, with both hands inside another man's chest, and someone had died 18 meters from her, and she hadn't even known. That was the work. It happened. That wasn't what made her cold. What made her cold came 3 minutes later, when she did what the counting machine behind her eyes told her to do, and checked who else had been in the department that night. Not the medical record. She wasn't permitted to view that. The visitor log. A paper ledger kept at the reception desk since 1990, where every person who wasn't a member of the department staff had to sign their name, time of arrival, time of departure, and reason for entering. Security kept it. Anyone could look at it. It wasn't a medical record. It was a ledger. June went downstairs and told Marion she needed to check something from an old night, and Marion, who had worked there for 17 years and had once looked away while 4 men stood along the hallway, took out the storage box for her without asking a question. June turned to the date. She followed the entries down the page, 2:40 in the morning. And there it was, handwritten in neat, slanting letters without the slightest hesitation, a name: Theodora Fairweather. The reason column was blank. The departure time column was blank. June looked at that name beneath the fluorescent lights of the reception desk at 3:20 in the morning, and she put the numbers together slowly, the way a person assembled a chart, a cardiovascular surgeon, at a hospital that wasn't hers, in the emergency department, not cardiology. At 2:40 in the morning, 12 minutes before the second unidentified patient was brought into room 7, 48 minutes before her brother was brought into room 4, and not one of her patients was inside that building. June closed the ledger. She thanked Marion. She took the stairs instead of the elevator because she needed 120 steps to think. And at the 90th step, she stopped, one hand resting on the railing, and asked the question she would carry with her for the next 11 weeks. What had she been doing there? The Tuesday evening flight from Houston to New Orleans was canceled because of a thunderstorm to the west, and August Fairweather, who didn't like waiting and didn't need to wait, told his driver to take the car. 5 hours on Interstate 10. He reached the gate at 10:40 that night, 11 hours earlier than the schedule everyone in that house had in their hands, and he didn't call anyone, not because he suspected anything, but because it was 10:40 at night, and he thought his wife was asleep. He entered through the kitchen door. It was the door he had always used, the door he had used since he was 7 years old, when his father was still alive, and children in that house weren't allowed through the front entrance with muddy shoes. The kitchen door opened into a short hallway leading to the dining room, and that hallway was dark, and there was light at the other end, and 3 voices. August stopped. He hadn't meant to listen. That was the detail he would later have to live with, that he stopped only because he heard his wife's name, and because he was tired, and because, during the first half-second, he still believed it was an ordinary conversation. Theodora's voice, even and low, the voice she used when reading test results. She was talking about June's work schedule. She was saying that the girl would be switching to the day shift for 2 weeks the following month, so they shouldn't do anything during that period. They should wait until she returned to nights and then decide. Prudence's voice, quieter, asked a question August couldn't make out. Theodora answered, because when people are exhausted, they don't go looking for lawyers, they simply leave. And August Fairweather, standing in the dark hallway of the house his great-grandfather had built, didn't understand. That was the strange part. He was a man who could sit at a negotiating table with 11 people and know exactly who was hiding what. A man who had survived 40 years by reading what wasn't being said. And for the first 30 seconds, he didn't understand, because his mind had no place prepared to hold something like this, because those words had no meaning inside a home. Then Cordelia spoke. And his mother said, in the warm and reasonable voice she used when delivering speeches about the moral duty of those with means, that she didn't hate her. Don't say it like that. She isn't a bad girl. Then she paused for exactly 1 beat. The beat June had learned to count over 3 months. She's simply the kind of person we hire, not the kind of person we marry. A glass was set down. Someone gave a quiet laugh. Only once, and it was Prudence, and the sound died more quickly than it normally would have. August didn't move. 9 minutes. Later, when he tried to reconstruct that night in order, that was the only number he would be certain of, because there was a clock on the kitchen wall his father had bought in 1979, and it chimed, and he counted its sounds, and he would spend a long time thinking about how his wife had counted everything for 3 months, and he had learned how to count in only 9 minutes. For 9 minutes, he stood there and listened. He heard about the gate code. He heard that they were waiting to see how long the girl could endure it. He heard Theodora say that if she became pregnant, everything would become much more difficult, so it would be best to finish this before then. He heard his mother say that her son wasn't a fool. He was merely going through a phase, and every man in this family had a phase, and his father had gone through one too, and eventually things arranged themselves. And he heard something else, something he wouldn't understand until 3 days later, when Theodora said very quickly, almost in passing, that the other woman wouldn't say anything again, that matter was finished. 9 minutes. Then August stepped into the dining room. The 3 women turned, and they saw a man in a travel coat, car keys in one hand, his face showing absolutely nothing. And the first thing that happened wasn't that someone cried out. The first thing that happened was that Prudence stood up. No one told her to stand. Her body did it on its own, the reflex of a small animal in a room when a larger one entered, and she stood there with both arms hanging at her sides and said nothing. Cordelia smiled. She opened her mouth and said, "You're home early." And her voice was flawless. And that was her mistake, because it was flawless. Because a mother caught by her son would panic. A mother who had been performing for 3 months would continue performing. August didn't answer her. He walked to the table. He placed the car keys on the wooden surface, gently, without a single unnecessary sound. and that movement silenced all three women faster than any shout could have. Then he looked at his sister, because during those 9 minutes he had learned who held the schedule, and he asked exactly one question. How long? No one answered. Cordelia began to say, "You misunderstood." And August didn't look at her, didn't turn his head, didn't raise a hand, and she fell silent. The clock on the kitchen wall chimed. Once, twice, 3 times. Then he spoke, and his voice wasn't any louder than before. And that was precisely what made Theodora Fairweather, who had held a scalpel for 22,000 hours without her hand ever trembling, look down at the table. "I'm asking again. How long?" The answer didn't come from Theodora. It came from Prudence. And it came because Prudence Vance was 29 years old and had been standing for 2 minutes, and her body couldn't bear it any longer. She said, 3 months. Since the day she arrived, Cordelia said her name once, sharp as a slap, Prudence. And Prudence said, "No, Aunt Cordelia, I'm not doing this anymore." And she dropped heavily into her chair and began to speak, and once she started, she couldn't stop. And for the next 40 minutes, standing in his own dining room, August Fairweather heard the full version of the previous 3 months, and he heard it in chronological order, with dates and times, almost perfectly matching a notebook locked inside a changing room locker in the Tulane Emergency Department, a notebook whose existence he had never known. But the thing that made him reach out and brace one hand against the back of a chair, a gesture no one in his life had ever seen him make, came at the 22nd minute, because during those 9 minutes in the darkness, August had believed he understood the entire structure. He had thought Prudence was the mouth. She was young, she had attached herself to June, she was the only person June confided in, and inside his mind, everything had fitted together with neat and merciless precision. It didn't fit, Prudence said. "I never told them anything. She told me about her brother once, at a restaurant on Magazine Street, during the first month, and I came home and didn't tell anyone. Not one word, I swear." Theodora said, "Prudence, that's enough." And Prudence said, "It isn't enough." And she turned toward August and said the name, Maeve Donnelly. The entire room went still, and August, who controlled the port of New Orleans, who hadn't recognized what his mother had been doing inside his own dining room for 92 days, asked in a very quiet voice, "Who?" Prudence said, "Her best friend, the nurse, her bridesmaid." Then she told him the rest, and she told it quickly, the way a person vomits. Theodora had approached Maeve during the first week, not the 8th week, not after everything had escalated, but the first week, before the first dinner, before June had even held a fork 30 grams lighter than everyone else's. She didn't threaten her, she didn't need to. She invited Maeve Donnelly for coffee, and placed a number on the table that she had researched in advance, $190,000. The nursing school debt Maeve had been paying for 8 years, and still had 14 years left to pay. The debt that had kept her from affording a bridesmaid's dress, the debt every nurse in America carried on her back like a weight no one else could see. And Theodora said she could make it disappear, not to hurt anyone. She said she only wanted to understand the girl. She said the family needed to know whom they were welcoming. "You understand. You're her friend. You want what's best for her, don't you?" Those were the words she used. "You want what's best for her, don't you?" And Maeve Donnelly, 30 years old, working 12-hour night shifts, who had never in her life had anyone place something that large on a table before her, said yes. Then she told them. She told them about June's mother. She told them about Wesley, including that night, including the 11 minutes, including the details June had spoken aloud only once in her life and had told only her. She sent them June's work schedule every month. She reported every incident at the hospital, who praised June, who didn't, how exhausted June was, whether June was close to breaking. She came to the estate on a Saturday morning in November to deliver a printed copy of something the doctor wanted to examine with her own eyes, and she wore the reddish-brown leather shoes bought on Royal Street, and when her friend called her name in the garden, her face made a calculation in half a second and produced a perfect answer, 1/4 of a second faster than the truth. And on Thursday night at the Roosevelt Hotel, 18 minutes after 5 doctors laughed at a table in the corner, Maeve Donnelly sent June a message telling her not to make a scene, that it wasn't worth it, because Theodora had called her first to make sure the life preserver was still in exactly the right place. June had seen all of it. That was the cruelest part, and the only person in that dining room who understood it was August, because he too had seen everything and had failed to see. She had caught the half-second of hesitation. She had noticed the shoes. She had counted the quarter-second in the answer. The machine behind her eyes had run through every detail, placed everything in the correct column, and delivered its conclusion, clean and cold as a chart. And June Holland had looked directly at that conclusion in the restroom of the Roosevelt Hotel and replied, "I'm fine, thank you," because she was drowning. Because she had spent 3 months without the gate code and had held a light for 40 minutes and had sat on the back steps at 4 o'clock in the morning with a notebook whose ink had dissolved into clouds. Because Maeve was the last thing remaining from the world in which June had once been a human being, and a drowning person doesn't test the rope. And August finally understood, too late, 3 months too late, why Prudence had lowered her face at the dinner when his mother made that remark about people in the family who had experience with such things. She hadn't lowered her face because she felt guilty. She had lowered it because she knew who had told them. And she was afraid. Rufus Okonkwo stood in the doorway to the hall and had been standing there for no one knew how long. No one had seen him enter. That was the skill of a man who had survived 31 years in that house, by becoming invisible at exactly the right moment and appearing at exactly the right moment. And now he was appearing, and in his hand he held a sheet of paper folded into quarters. He said, "Sir, if I may." Cordelia said, "Rufus, this isn't the time." And Rufus didn't look at her. 31 years, and it was the first time in his life he hadn't looked at her when she spoke his name. He walked to the table and placed the paper in front of August and said, "I sent 3 messages." August opened it. They were screenshots, printed on the old printer in the steward's office. 3 messages, 3 dates, sent through the estate's internal communications system. The first, dated September 14th. "Sir, I believe you should know that your wife isn't being treated properly in this house." The second, dated October 23rd. "Sir, this isn't stopping. Today your wife stood outside the gate for 4 minutes." The third, dated November 11th. "Sir, I believe something belonging to your wife has been thrown away. I didn't dare act without permission. Please call me back." August looked at the 3 dates. September 14th was the night of the dinner with 14 guests and the silverware. October 23rd was the week his wife had pressed the intercom on 5 consecutive mornings. November 11th was the day of the family portrait, and he had received none of them. He said, "Rufus, I didn't receive these." And Rufus said, "I know." Then he explained, in the steady voice of a 58-year-old man who had rehearsed this sentence in his mind for 3 months, that the organization's security protocol didn't allow anyone inside the estate to contact August directly while he was traveling, not because anyone had forbidden it, because August himself had established the rule. 5 years earlier, after the incident at Dock Number 7, after one of his men had died because a message had been read by someone who should never have seen it, he had ordered that all communication leaving the house pass through a controlled intermediary, one person who filtered it, one funnel, so nothing could get out without being screened. He remembered that meeting. He remembered himself saying those words, and he remembered who had offered to take responsibility for setting it up the following day, so reasonably that no one objected, on the grounds that if he was injured while away, the people at home needed to be able to reach a doctor within 30 seconds, and the only person who knew which doctor to call, who was on duty, and where everyone was his sister. Emergency medical necessity. That was the phrase she had used 5 years earlier. And that was the phrase written into the protocol, and in 5 years not one person in the organization had questioned it, because it saved lives, because it had truly saved lives twice. Rufus's 3 messages had reached that channel, and stopped there. August Fairweather stood in his dining room and looked at those 3 lines and understood the thing he would carry for the rest of his life. He hadn't been blind. That would have been much easier. A blind man wasn't at fault. A blind man was pitiable. A blind man could be forgiven by saying he simply hadn't seen. He hadn't been blind. He had been blindfolded, and he had woven that blindfold with his own hands 5 years earlier, in a room at the port, from the finest threads he possessed, with the best intentions he had, to protect the people he loved. He had built a perfect system so nothing could leave without being screened, and he had placed the screen in one person's hands, and for 3 months that person had stood between him and his wife, and every time someone tried to reach him, that hand had extended and removed the message, neatly, according to procedure, without violating a single rule. No traitor had broken into his home. No one had picked the lock. The lock was still sound. The lock was doing exactly what it had been designed to do. August sat down. It was the first time he had sat since entering the room, and all three women noticed, and no one spoke. He read the 3 messages again. Then he read them once more. He said nothing for a long time. The clock his father had bought in 1979 chimed 11 times on the kitchen wall, and no one in the dining room dared count except him. Then August said, without lifting his head, his voice rough in the way a person's voice becomes rough after too much silence compressed into too little time. "Rufus, you've been in this house for 31 years. Rufus said, "Yes, sir." And August asked, "Why didn't you drive to the airport and find me?" And Rufus Okonkwo, who had carried him in his arms when he was 7 years old and had broken his arm beneath the magnolia tree, looked directly into his face and spoke the only sentence he would say in this entire story, and it forgave no one, not even himself. "Because I trusted your system. Just as your wife trusted you." June arrived home at 11:40 that night, and for the first time in 3 months, the gate was already open, and she knew immediately that something had happened. She entered through the kitchen door. The dining room was brightly lit, and there were 4 people inside, and no one was speaking, and on the table lay a set of car keys and a sheet of paper folded into quarters and opened flat. August stood when she entered. He said her name, and June, who had counted 27 entries in a notebook kept in the changing room, looked around the room for 2 seconds, the same 2 seconds she had in the emergency department, and she read everything. She said, "You know?" He said, "I know." Then Cordelia Fairweather stood. She didn't raise her voice. Her son had cornered her for 40 minutes. She had lost everything in 40 minutes, and she knew it. And anyone might have expected a woman like that to cry, or deny it, or beg. She did none of those things. She looked directly at June Holland, who was still wearing her nurse's uniform and the shoes she had worn for 16 hours, and said, "Do you know how long he lay in there?" No one understood what she meant, except June, because the counting machine behind her eyes had switched on and was running, and it had caught something in the woman's voice, something June had heard 4,000 times in hallways outside patient rooms and had never mistaken. Cordelia said, 21 days. "My husband went in for something minor, something small, and 3 weeks later, he never came out. Not because of his condition, because of an infection, because of something he picked up inside that place, inside the very place that was supposed to heal him." And she continued, and her voice remained steady. And that was what made it frightening, saying that she had stayed there for 21 days. She said she slept in that chair. She said she knew all their names. She said she taught herself how to read the numbers on the monitor without anyone teaching her. And by the 18th day, she knew before they even entered the room. Then she told them about that night, 3 o'clock in the morning. On the 21st day, she stood in the hallway and caught the sleeve of a night shift nurse, a young woman, and asked whether they could call the doctor on duty one more time, only once more. And that nurse looked at her, and she said, "Ma'am, there isn't anything more to be done now. You should go home and rest," Cordelia said. "I remember her face. It has been 22 years. I still remember her face." June said nothing, Cordelia said, "and I went home. That is what I can't forgive. Not her, myself. She told me to leave and I left. And he died at 5:10. And there was no one in the room with him." Then she said the thing June had understood 30 seconds earlier, the final piece settling into place with a sound only she could hear. For 22 years, Cordelia had run the Fairweather Foundation, $1,800,000 every year for community health programs, 7-minute speeches about the moral obligation of those with means, and she said, without shame, in the voice of someone reading test results, that she didn't do it out of kindness. She did it because money was the only thing in the world that made people wearing that uniform stand up when she entered a room. Then she looked at June and said, "Do you know what it feels like to beg someone dressed like you?" The room went silent. August took one step toward his mother, and June extended one hand without looking at him, and he stopped. And June Holland, 32 years old, standing in her nurse's uniform in her husband's family dining room near midnight, said, "Yes." Cordelia blinked. June said, "When I was 19, my mother, the final 4 months, and I caught people's sleeves in hallways at 3 o'clock in the morning and asked them to try one more time. And they looked at me exactly that way." June said, "I know that look precisely, Mrs. Fairweather. I received it before I learned how to give it. And that is why I worked the night shift for 10 years. Do you think I was there for the pay? I was there because I was the one who stayed in the room." Cordelia Fairweather said nothing. That was the first time. In 3 months, in 40 minutes, in this entire story, the woman who had always possessed a perfect sentence for every moment stood there without one, and her hand searched for the back of the chair, and she sat down. And at that exact moment, while everyone in the room was watching a 63-year-old woman lower herself into a chair, June Holland was listening to something else. The machine behind her eyes was replaying the previous 4 minutes, and it had stopped at 2 places. The first was that Cordelia hadn't said hospital-acquired infection. She had used its full clinical name correctly, including the part even doctors often shortened. The second was that she had said she taught herself to read the numbers on the monitor, and then she named a specific measurement, and she used the exact abbreviation only medical professionals used, the name that didn't appear on the screen. The name a person learned only by standing beside others and hearing them say it thousands of times. Patients' families didn't speak that way. June had stood beside 4,000 families in 10 years, and not one of them had spoken that way. June didn't ask. She looked at Cordelia Fairweather sitting in the chair with both hands resting in her lap, and she recorded it, cleanly, without emotion, the way a nurse recorded a symptom that didn't yet have a place in the chart. Then she left it there. It would take her another 14 months to understand what she had just seen. Barrett Shaw arrived at 6 o'clock in the morning. He was 45 years old, wearing a gray suit, and he placed 3 files on the dining table from left to right, then stepped back and said nothing. And that was the entirety of his role that night. No one was touched. No one was threatened. In the home of the man who controlled the entire port of New Orleans, everything ended with paper. The first file belonged to Theodora. August didn't open it. He pushed it across the table toward his sister and said, "Read it yourself." Inside were printed access logs from the personnel system at Tulane General Hospital. 19 separate entries into June Holland's private medical and shift treatment records between September and November, each one linked to a login code, and that code belonged to an inter-hospital account issued to consulting physicians, and that account was registered in the name of Theodora Fairweather. Barrett Shaw said, "This is a direct violation of federal HIPAA regulations. You didn't need to do anything with the information. The fact that you viewed it 19 times without a treatment-related reason is enough." And he delivered the next sentence in the voice someone might use to read the weather forecast, saying, "We don't need to call anyone. We only need to file it." Theodora Fairweather looked at those papers and understood immediately, because she was a doctor and knew exactly what they meant. She knew they meant an investigation by the Louisiana State Board of Medical Examiners, and she knew how that investigation would end when there were 19 lines in an access log, and she knew that the woman she had spent 3 months digging a hole for hadn't needed to dig anything at all, because Theodora had dug it herself, 19 strokes deep, with the same hands that had held a scalpel for 22,000 hours. But that wasn't the final blow. The final blow came when August opened the second file, and he didn't hand it to anyone. He held it in his hands and said, "I'm going to ask you one question. On the night of October 14th last year, what were you doing in the Tulane Emergency Department at 2:40 in the morning?" June, leaning against the kitchen doorway, lifted her head. Theodora didn't answer, and August continued, evenly, slowly, without raising his voice at all, saying that 2 of his men had been shot that night. Not 1, 2. The first car carried the first man, and August had driven it himself. The second car carried a man named Dominic Vella, 30 years old, who worked at dock number 4, and someone had called the family doctor because that was procedure. The procedure August himself had established, and the family doctor had been there at 2:40. Before August. August said, "You were there before me. You entered at 2:40. Vella was taken into room 7 at 2:52, and Barrett Shaw placed the second sheet of paper on the table, a copy of the visitor log page, neat slanting handwriting, the reason column blank, the departure time column blank. Then August spoke, and this was when his voice finally changed, not rising but dropping lower. "How long were you with him?" Theodora said. "I needed to find you. I didn't know where you were. They told me you had been shot too, and I didn't know which room you were in." August said, "I know. That is the answer." Then he said, "Vella died at 4:17. Alone. You went upstairs looking for me, and he remained there, and he died at 4:17, while I was in room 4, and the person holding my hand then, the person who stayed in the room, was her." He pointed toward June without turning his head. Then he said the sentence Theodora Fairweather would hear again inside her mind every night for many years afterward. "You said my wife works downstairs. My man died downstairs. While you went upstairs." No one spoke. The clock his father had bought in 1979 chimed 6 times. Theodora Fairweather stood and left the dining room, and she didn't look at anyone, and she didn't say a word, and that was the last time she ever passed through that doorway. She still had her degree. She still had her 22,000 hours. She had only lost everything those 22,000 hours had purchased for her. The third file belonged to Cordelia. Her authority over 3 family trusts was transferred, effective immediately. She kept her allowance, kept the house in Charleston, kept everything money could buy. She lost exactly one thing, the only thing she had spent 22 years acquiring, the power to make other people stand when she entered a room. She read the document carefully from beginning to end, like a professional. Then she folded it and said, "I understand," and went upstairs. She left the estate at 9 o'clock the following morning. There was no file for Prudence. Barrett Shaw handed her a thin envelope containing a notice that her name had been removed from the list of beneficiaries and a one-way plane ticket to Portland. Prudence held it and looked at August and began to say, "August, I told you. I was the one who told you." And then she waited. And August Fairweather said nothing. He didn't forgive her, and he didn't condemn her, and he didn't look at her for longer than 1 second. He turned away, and Prudence Vance stood there with the envelope in her hand and understood, in the space of about 3 seconds, that she had spent the previous 3 months sitting silently at that table, and the price of remaining silent wasn't being shouted at. The price was this: she had become someone to whom he no longer needed to say anything. The silence was the sentence. They moved into the house by the lake in February. It stood 15 minutes from Bayou Teche, a single-story house, old, with a metal roof and a wooden porch that creaked at the third board every time someone crossed it, and it had no gate. It had only a dirt road, a mailbox, and a door to which June had a key. She carried it in her pocket for the first 2 weeks, not because she needed to use it, but simply so she could touch it. She still couldn't sleep at 3 o'clock in the morning. 10 years of night shifts couldn't be undone in 2 weeks, perhaps not even in 20 years. And every night at around 2:50, her eyes opened in the darkness and her body sat upright before she had time to object. And she went down to the kitchen, and she stood there holding a glass of water she didn't drink. On the 9th night, August came down after her. He didn't ask whether she couldn't sleep. He didn't turn on the overhead light. He sat at the table in the chair across from her, exactly as he had sat in her 646-square-foot apartment during the storm 2 years earlier, and he waited. And June, standing with her back against the sink, said the thing she had carried inside her chest for 92 days. She said, "I'm going to tell you why I stayed silent." He said nothing. She said, "I was afraid that if I broke the peace, I would lose you. Not because of them, because I thought the price you would have to pay for choosing between your family and your wife was too high, and I thought that if I forced you to choose, then even if you chose me, 3 years later you would look at me one morning and make the calculation." Then she stopped. Then she said the rest, the true part, the part she hadn't dared to put into words even for herself. "I didn't trust you to make the right choice." The kitchen was very quiet. Something moved in the water outside, some creature, and then the sound was gone. August didn't stand. He didn't reach across the table. He said, "You had reasons not to trust me." She said, "Some," he said, "not all of them." And June Holland, who had counted everything in her life, said, "Some of them I invented because I was afraid. My father taught me how to invent them when I was 19, and I've become very good at it." He sat with that sentence for a long time. Then he said, "I asked Rufus why he didn't drive to the airport and find me, and he said he trusted my system, just as you trusted me." He said, "During those 3 months, you protected me from something I should have been protecting you from, and I was home for 41 nights. 41 nights I sat at that table and ate dinner and looked around and thought everything was fine, and I'm the man this entire city believes can read a room." Then he stood. He walked around the table and stopped in front of her, and he didn't touch her. And that was what June would always remember about that night, that he didn't pull her against his chest, didn't take her hand, didn't do what men did when they wanted to end a conversation with their bodies instead of their words. He stood there with both arms at his sides and looked at her, and in the light from the small lamp above the stove, June saw his face. He was growing older. She had noticed it over the previous few weeks and hadn't said anything. Not badly, not quickly, but in the way men who carried heavy things always aged, the weight beginning to show along the jaw and in eyes that had stopped expecting rest. He said, "I'm sorry." Then he spoke again, and his voice didn't break. and it didn't grow louder. And that was why it went straight into the center of her chest. Not only for that night, for every day before it. June looked at him. She thought about the 30 seconds in the garden with Maeve, and the answer that had come 1/4 of a second too quickly. She thought about the 27 entries in a notebook she had locked inside a changing room locker instead of bringing home, and she understood that she had left it there because she hadn't wanted it inside that house, and that revealed something about her she had avoided for 3 months. She thought about her mother. You aren't the one who decides who lives. You're the one who stays in the room. And June Holland said, I know. Nothing more. She didn't say, I forgive you. She had stood beside the beds of 4,000 people over 10 years, and she had learned that some things couldn't be spoken before their proper time, and that saying them too soon wasn't kindness. It was cowardice wearing kindness's clothes. She wasn't there yet. She was here, at the place where people acknowledged that what had happened, and looked at it, and chose, with their eyes open, to continue. It was the beginning of the road, not the end, but it was a road. She reached out and placed her right hand against his chest. Nothing more. The gesture of a person checking whether something was real. The gesture she had made 40,000 times with strangers while searching for a heartbeat, and this time she didn't count. He placed his hand over hers and held it there, and they stood that way in the kitchen at 3 o'clock in the morning, 2 people who couldn't sleep, while outside the lake lay dark and still, and for the first time in 92 nights, the counting machine behind June's eyes finally fell silent. Their daughter was born on a September morning at a small hospital in Lafayette, 2 hours from New Orleans, a place that appeared on no list, belonged to no system a doctor at Ochsner could search, and August had chosen it for that reason, and for another one, because the waiting room looked out over a row of oak trees, and because June said she liked the chair. Labor lasted 15 hours. June Holland, who had stood beside the beds of 4,000 people over 10 years, lay in that bed for the first time, and she hated every minute of it, and she said so in words she would never repeat afterward. August stayed for all 15 hours. He didn't try to make it neater than it was. He didn't say you're doing so well or it's almost over or any of the things people say to soothe themselves. He simply stayed in the room. The baby was born at 7:10 in the morning, healthy, and she cried so loudly that one of the nurses laughed, and she had a head full of black hair, so thick that everyone marveled. Where did all this hair come from? And June, exhausted, sweating, her vision blurred, heard those words and thought they were the finest words anyone had ever spoken to her. August held their daughter for the first time after June did. He didn't reach for her. He waited until June looked up and nodded, and then he extended both hands and received the child with the care of a man who had spent his entire life holding things that could break and had never been so afraid of breaking anything. He stood by the window with the baby against his chest and looked at her face for a long time and said nothing. Then he said, "She has your chin," June said. "She has your forehead." He said, "I have a handsome forehead." And she laughed, and she recorded that laugh in the separate, silent part of her mind, the part that had quietly counted the ratio between genuine smiles and performed ones for 3 months, and she recorded that this one was real. The baby's name was Bertie Maureen Holland Fairweather. Maureen was her mother's name, and on the birth certificate, Holland came before Fairweather, not because anyone had fought for it, but because August was the one who filled out the form and wrote the names in that order without asking, and when June saw it, she said nothing, and neither did he. It remained there, in ink, permanently. Notices were sent by the lawyer to 3 separate addresses. No one was invited. No one came. 1 year later, on a September afternoon, there was an envelope inside the mailbox beside the dirt road. There was no letter, only an old photograph, its edges worn, its colors yellowed with age. In the picture stood a young woman of about 23, wearing a white nurse's uniform outside the entrance to Charity Hospital in New Orleans, a stack of files held against her chest, her hair tied at the nape of her neck, laughing because someone beyond the frame had just said something funny. 1984. June turned it over. Shaking handwriting, the handwriting of a 64-year-old woman, written in ballpoint pen, only one line. "I was once one of you too. Before I married him." June Holland stood beside the dirt road for a long time, and everything slid into its proper place with a sound only she could hear. The full clinical term Cordelia had spoken without hesitation, the abbreviation for a measurement that didn't appear on the monitor, the name a person learned only by standing beside others and hearing them say it thousands of times. Cordelia had said she taught herself to read those numbers, that no one had shown her. She had lied, not to June, inside her own accusation, because at 3 o'clock in the morning on the 21st day, when Cordelia Fairweather caught the sleeve of a night shift nurse in the hallway and begged for one more attempt, she wasn't begging a stranger. She was begging the exact version of herself she had discarded 22 years earlier to enter a house with white columns and a gate code. And that young woman had looked at her and spoken the same sentence Cordelia herself had once said to other people 100 times. And Cordelia had gone home. 22 years of running a medical foundation hadn't been about taking revenge on people who wore that uniform. It had been about proving that she had made the right choice when she took it off. And then her son brought home a woman who had chosen differently, and hadn't died, and hadn't regretted it, and sat down in Cordelia's chair. June carried the photograph into the kitchen. She pinned it to the refrigerator door with a crab-shaped magnet Bertie liked. Not to forgive. She left it there to remember exactly what happened to a woman who believed she had been forced to choose. At 3 o'clock that morning, June woke. Because she always woke at 3 o'clock in the morning, and 10 years couldn't be undone. But she wasn't going to work. Bertie was awake in her crib, talking to the ceiling in a language only she understood. And June lifted her and carried her downstairs, and stood beside the window. And the baby was warm and heavy and smelled like a child who had slept enough. And June Holland did what she always did when she held a human being in her arms. She counted the breaths. 1, 2, 3. But this time, it wasn't to keep someone alive. This time, it was only to listen. She had saved 300 people in 10 years and had stood outside a gate for 3 months. And now she stood in her own kitchen at 3 o'clock in the morning with her daughter in her arms. And she wasn't keeping watch over anything. She was simply awake, because she wanted to be awake. If June's story touched something inside you, please leave a like and share it with someone you know who is also smiling through things they should never have had to endure, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you can hear many more compelling stories every day. How did this story make you feel? And what part of June's journey stayed with you the most? Leave a comment and tell us, because we truly want to hear the feelings that come from deep within your heart. May you and your family always have abundant health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.